My name is Chukwemeka Onimadu. I serve as the Program Specialist, Women's Economic Empowerment with the UN Women Nigeria Country Office. I also double as an economist, a feminist economist precisely. Women's empowerment through affirmative procurement is an innovative initiative to expand economic opportunities for women-owned businesses as well as women-led businesses in Nigeria, with the objective of achieving that expansion through the procurement process. What we were able to do through research is to identify several pathways for empowering women, especially given the context of shrinking fiscal space for economic empowerment. One of those very viable opportunities and pathways that we've been able to identify is through public sector procurement opportunities and now through the private sector procurement opportunities. We feel that through reforming the procurement process landscape and also reforming institutions as well as existing practices, that we will be able to increase the opportunities that present themselves to women-owned and women-led businesses. In the long term, a lot of the shape of the interventions for the women's economic empowerment through affirmative procurement will depend on some of the successes already envisaged in the short to immediate term. For example, we've been able to see that through the procurement process, women-owned businesses and women-led businesses have been trained on business development skills, financial literacy skills, leveraging on technology to expand their business operations, and also the ability to meet compliance documentations as required by the Procurement Act in Nigeria. And all these skills, all this capacity, all these trainings are also requisites, especially in the context of expanding business activities beyond the procurement process. So in a nutshell, in the long run, the trainings and the capacities that will be given to women through the Women's Economic Empowerment Program through affirmative procurement will also open new pathways, new opportunities for women-owned businesses, especially in the context of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. So all the skills that they need, all the necessary standardization that they need, they're already learning under the program, and they will be using this as some form of first step towards new and emerging opportunities from the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. So we see in the long term women-owned businesses who already have the necessary skills and necessary capacities to exploit emerging opportunities from structural changes, especially through the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. We must understand that when we want to introduce gender considerations in the procurement process, it's a relatively new concept in the context of West and Central Africa, particularly in Nigeria. We've had instances when we approach several stakeholders in the procurement space, in the procurement landscape, and their first initial reaction is that in procurement, it is the principle of competition, it's the principle of value for money, and it's the principle of transparency and accountability, and that procurement should be gender neutral, gender blind, if I must say so. However, we've been able to sensitize and also provide the economic and social rationale for including women-owned businesses to be part of this procurement process. What we know is that a significant amount of resources is being spent by the government as well as private sector organizations to forge our procurement processes. Unfortunately, a lot of women-owned businesses do not participate and do not benefit from these huge resources. What we want to achieve is to see how we can redirect some of those resources to women-owned businesses. And this also presents the challenge itself. Are women-owned businesses having the capacity to exploit these opportunities? Do women-owned businesses have the social capital? Do they have the agency? Do they have technical knowledge to exploit procurement opportunities when they do emerge? Is there a societal expectation of who should even participate in procurement processes? And these are some of the challenges that women have faced in the procurement process. There is social norms, there is biases, and there is significant experience of women having sexual harassment when they try to bid for procurement opportunities. There is also the challenge of access to credits, where the expectation by law is that women-owned businesses should use their own resources to implement a contract that they've won. We know from historical imbalances that women have lower opportunities. Women have less tendency to get credit from formal financial institutions relative to men. The cumulative of all these challenges is that women become risk averse and tend not to participate in the procurement process. So these are some of the challenges that women have faced, but through this program, we want to address these challenges. We want to work with financial institutions to have tailor-made financial instruments that meet the needs of women, recognizing that women-owned businesses themselves are not a homogeneous group. We also want to use interventions within this program to ensure that women-owned businesses are not just participating, but they are also benefiting from the procurement process and benefiting in very significant terms. One, to reduce poverty, especially the feminization of poverty in Nigeria and West and Central African region. Two, to create jobs, especially at the micro, small and medium scale enterprise level. And also to ensure that women-owned businesses become resilient, especially to domestic and exogenous shocks. With support from the African Development Bank, through funding from the WeFi initiative, UN Women has been able to collaborate with a menu of stakeholders in implementing the Women's Economic Empowerment through Affirmative Procurement Initiative in Nigeria. As usual, we are working very closely with our line ministry, the Federal Ministry of Women Affairs, in implementing the program. The ministry serves as the chair of the steering committee for the program. Additionally, the ministry is also driving for the reforms of procurement policies in Nigeria. They led in the inclusion of the 30% quota for women-owned businesses in the National Policy on Women's Economic Empowerment and Action Plan. Beyond the ministry, we are also working with the state-level Bureau of Public Procurement in both Lagos and Kaduna states, and they have been very instrumental in training and sensitizing both women-owned businesses as well as procurement officials working with the government to understand and implement strategies for gender-responsive procurement. Additionally, both Lagos State and Kaduna State Bureau of Public Procurement have developed draft policies for affirmative action in procurement processes. And what is very significant in the work that they are doing is the set aside quota for all public procurement opportunities for women-owned businesses in both Lagos and Kaduna states. So in a sense, these two agencies are key and they are leaders in affirmative action for procurement. We are also working with non-government organizations, specifically civil society organizations, as well as other NGOs, non-profits. Specifically, we've worked with Public and Private Development Center, PPDC, who helped us in our research work and the mapping of women-owned businesses in both Lagos and Kaduna states to identify the needs of women-owned businesses, as well as the challenges and the opportunities that present themselves for intervening for women-owned businesses in the context of participating in public procurements. We're also working in Kaduna State with Zamani Foundation to drive our work around working with the private sector to engender their supply chains and also increase their commitments to the women empowerment principles. In Lagos State, we are working with Women in Successful Careers, WISCA, who serve as our private sector liaison. And specifically, we are working with WISCA to also engender the supply chain for private sector organizations and also increase the commitment to the women empowerment principles in Lagos State. Our work with the private sector is being chaired by both WISCA and Zamani Foundation. What is very key in this intervention, this program that we are implementing, is that we need to provide and upscale the capacity needs of women-owned businesses, especially in the context of assessing, understanding, bidding for public contracts as well as private sector contracts. For this, we are training and we've trained 800 women-owned businesses in Nigeria, and the figures are above the thousands when it comes to the West and Central Africa region. And we're working very closely with one of our key partners, DOTAKEACTION, who are implementing these trainings for women-owned businesses. Beyond these strategic partners, we are also working very closely with the UN agencies through the UN procurement network to ensure that within the UN system itself, gender responsive procurement is being practiced, implemented with significant human impact, as well as on MSMEs. Lastly, beyond the UN system, beyond working with the government through the federal ministries, and beyond our strategic non-profit partners, we also have a collective of stakeholders who are part of our advocacy groups that are also asking from a national level and a sub-national level for the set-aside quota for women-owned businesses. Beyond Women has just established a coalition of women who are going to be asking for the domestication of the National Policy on Women's Economic Empowerment, an action plan that allows for 30% affirmative action in procurement processes. In implementing this program, we've learned a lot of lessons, and we are still learning. However, I can highlight some of the very important lessons that would help shape future interventions and scale up. First, compliance is a problem. Beyond training women to understand how to bid for procurement opportunities, beyond providing information, and beyond the reforms for the policy, procurement requires certain documentation. And for you to be able to participate, especially in public procurements, then you must meet up with those documentations. So compliance to those documentations is very, very important. We've learned that about 77% of all the women we've trained have partial compliance to all the documentation. And to address this, we established the Compliance Incubator in collaboration with DOTAKEACTION to support women-owned businesses to be able to complete and get all the compliance documents to enable them effectively compete for public sector procurement opportunities. Secondly, women-owned businesses exist in all sectors. Prior to the interventions in the program, we did conduct a baseline research. And what we found was that if you classify procurement opportunities by goods, services, and civil works, you will most often see more women participating in contracts defined by goods and very fewer amount of women in businesses participating in services and civil works. Specifically civil works, we had very few women. And the concern had always been that there are no women in civil works. What we did as UN Women was to engage with networks and associations. So we engaged with business networks, we engaged with associations. For example, Association of Engineers, Association of Procurement Practitioners, and asked them, is it true we don't have women in construction? Is it true we don't have women in engineering? Is it true we don't have women in architecture? When we made those efforts, we realized that there are women who can provide significant and competitive bids for government contracts. The problem has been there has been no space for them to thrive. In trying to address this, in the draft policy documents that have been developed in both Lagos and Kaduna states, we try to make sure that there are inclusions to create spaces for women-owned businesses, especially in these sectors, civil works and services, for them to thrive. So yes, those women exist. Thirdly, and this is very key for us, is to understand that the needs of women are not the same, especially the needs of women in business. The needs of women in the formal sector are different from the needs of women in the informal sector. Also, the needs of women as micro-enterprises are different from women who are small or medium-scale enterprises. And having a one-size policy to fit all these needs is also problematic. For example, in the policy that was drafted in Kaduna State, they have made inclusions to fit those specific needs of women. So going forward, it's important to recognize that even though that women-owned businesses are often not part of the procurement process, in addressing these challenges, it's important to also recognize the differentiated needs of women-owned businesses, even if we are classifying them as women-owned needs. And then lastly, which is a very, very significant problem, is on defining who and what is a woman-owned business. In developing the policies in both Lagos and Kaduna states, this problem of definition came up. In some instances, we followed international best practices in the definition of women-owned businesses, greater than or equals to at least 51% ownership. But that has also brought issues where the public procurement agencies have cited cases where you can have that definition in place, but then only male-owned businesses will benefit. So what has been very critical for us is that while we follow international best practices in defining who is a women-owned business, we also have to contextualize those definitions in the states where we want to implement gender-responsive procurement practices. For example, in Lagos State, in their vendor portal, they have created a provision where everyone who is going to register must identify if they're a woman-owned or male-owned business. They've also increased that definition to also capture women-led businesses as well as women-led cooperatives. So going forward, while we leverage on as a baseline the international best practices for the definition of who a women-owned business is, it's also important to understand the context on the definition of women-owned businesses.